Elden Ring is, far and away, the greatest open-world RPG of our generation. FromSoft over the years has honed and refined the formula by which they create their games, and in the leap to the open-world subgenre, they brought over their masterful ability to guide the player without explicit directions, even while offering almost complete freedom of choice. For all its excellence, however, Elden Ring has had some bumps in the road of its rollout. I believe there are some flaws in the game, between software issues like frame stuttering, and the balancing has issues where you can become radically overleveled too easily, in my opinion. That said, one of the contentions I've heard with Elden Ring is this idea that there are too many repeated bosses. Here are some examples of people making this argument.
A rematch in a menu is great and should always be included in these games, but when it's the same fight serving as the climax of another area, again, it makes both the current rematch and the first round take a hit in quality. This encounter with the dragon in the swamp was one of the most amazing moments I had in the first few hours with the game. The game ruined this by making me fight what feels like dozens of these, just over and over with the same dragon fight that was always identical except for the element of its breath attack. And so the first fight retroactively became boring as well.
Now, while none of the content necessarily feels like game padding, there's still something to be said about leaving the player wanting more. There are so many repeated areas, I felt as though I had scavenged through countless caves, catacombs, and mines that all looked and felt very similar to one another, with most of them ending in a reskinned boss battle. Like, yeah, this cat statue was super cool the first time I fought it, but not so much the fifth time. Maybe instead of shooting fire, the cat shoots lightning, but it doesn't change the fact that I'm still engaging in a recycled boss battle.
They got rid of any of the interesting gimmicks or any of the unique quirks of fights from Dark Souls 1, and instead, we are left with a bunch of extremely forgettable bosses that you fight several times over the course of the game. There's the Tree Sentinel, which you fight at least 4 times. Burial Watchdog, which you fight at least 3 times. Aird Tree Avatar, which you fight 13 fucking times, as I've said before. The Dragons, which you also fight like 8 times. This is fucking ridiculous, dude.
Less than half of the bosses in this game are unique. And mind you, that is a generous number as it includes different dragons and knights that all share similar or the same movesets. Over half to 2/3 of the bosses that you will be fighting will be bosses you've already seen before. As just a personal example of this, there's an early game boss called the Knights Cavalry. I have fought the Knights Cavalry 4 times so far, in one playthrough. 4 times. And there are at least 5 more in this game, which means you can fight the Knights Cavalry 9 times if you want to. Why? What is the reason to have this same boss so many times?
Reskinning a boss with minuscule variations is something both I and the community have roasted past entries for. If those were worthy of our ire, how do we reconcile this? Regal Ancestor Spirit is reused in both boss battle and spawning method via the sconces underground. Magma Worm appears multiple times in caves, Mount Gelmir, and Volcano Manor. Flying Dragon Aguila is like rainbow ice cream with all its various flavors, and basic ripoffs. Bosses in Elden Ring instead become commonplace affairs against familiar foes. A problem exacerbated by the slew of lesser mini-bosses that have dozens of reskins to their name across the lands between.
I've edited these clips for brevity, but I have not taken them out of context to change their meaning. You can find the full videos in the description. No shade to any of these people, but this is a criticism I simply do not think is well thought out. Like most popularly repeated criticism, I would suspect that these are simply safe statements to make that seem solid because they address a personal frustration point, but do not reflect an actual gameplay flaw. I'm sure all of these people would immediately jump to the assertion that this is their opinion, and that's actually quite fair. You are entitled to enjoy or not enjoy things accordingly, and to voice those viewpoints to your heart's content. Whereas most content creators are careful to nuance their position, there's undeniably some influence they have, unintentionally, and so I seek to bring balance. What I hope with this video is that if your opinion is that Elden Ring has too many repeated bosses, you will at least gain an appreciation for it, even if your opinion is still unchanged. Before I get to my main points, I want to point out the obvious. In a perfect world, games would not repeat any content. Every boss, minor enemy, building, column, tree, rock, blade of grass, and insect would be uniquely modeled and animated. But computers simply are not powerful enough to handle that kind of experience yet. Most gamers on Steam are still using GTX 1060s, and many people still game on laptops and consoles, and nobody has enough SSD space to install a game that is a terabyte large. There's an obvious technical concession that has to be made in order to expand content while managing file sizes and limiting computation. With that out of the way, let's get into my first reason. The most simple and explainable answer to why Elden Ring repeats bosses, from a game design perspective, is that replaying content gives the player a tangible sense of their own accomplishment. As the player gets better at learning to read enemy patterns, or more fluently employ his or her own arsenal, repeating content serves to remind the player of that improvement. In the case where enemies are not scaled up to provide a challenge at the player's level, they serve to show the player the effects of leveling their weapons and their abilities directly. This is something I think most gamers understand innately. Increasing your own level makes earlier content feel easier. Elden Ring's area leveling has some balancing issues in my opinion, but it is important to note that repeated bosses, or bosses that start stacking up with other bosses for combo fights, are a way From is indirectly complimenting the player for their progress of learning and managing patterns and the accrued power of new weapons and levels. Enemies that were hard in the past now feel easy, either because of your increase in power, or because you fought other things that were so much harder that going back to fight an old boss now feels like a breeze. Some bosses that are clear demonstrations of this are the Beastman of Farum Azula, which you first encounter in a Limgrave cave, which later just becomes a generic world enemy once you reach Farum Azula. The Crucible Knight, also in Limgrave, who you can fight variants of as world enemies, and occasionally bosses throughout the game. Dragons, who, despite having multiple boss variants, also have a world enemy variant in the Dragon Barrow that feels quite easy after you've dispatched of the first one. The Crystalians, who, while they scale up in different areas and are eventually world enemies, also have boss variants, where multiple forms of them stack on top of each other to make sure you've leveled or learned their patterns individually. These are just what I can think of off the top of my head. I'm sure there are many other enemies in this vein. From a game design perspective, an idea that game devs employ often is to use environmental clues to teach a player to recognize something. Sometimes these mechanics are stated explicitly, but often they're subtle hints that the player recognizes at some point. A perfect example of this is the famously, quote, spammed, unquote, boss of Elden Ring, the Erdtree avatar. While many complain about the constant reuse of a boss that reuses an attack pattern from an enemy in Dark Souls 1, I think it's pretty clear that the intent is that you will associate the Erdtree avatars with finding a new tier for your Flask of Wondrous Physic. While certainly not the only source, or the only item that they drop, the Erdtree avatars most frequently will drop an item that is the same as the other Erdtree avatars. Similarly, the major dragons enable you to unlock their themed draconic powers in the chapels. While some people complain that these dragons are just different flavors of the same enemy, it's important to note that these enemies are optional. So if you have no interest in obtaining the Scarlet Rot Breath, but want the Freezing Breath, you can pick which power you want to use in your build. These thematic drops also make sense in the case of the Ulcerated Tree Spirits, the Night Cavalry, and other repeated enemies that drop loot associated with their in-game appearance, such as armor or weapons, or lore. This brings me to my third reason for repeating bosses in Elden Ring. This is the big one. We're going to park here for a little bit. Perhaps most importantly, for a FromSoft RPG, repeated enemies almost always have a story-based reason for their reuse. In a genre of game where the story is famously obtuse and hard to follow, context clues are used to guide the player to come to conclusions. As Miyazaki has stated in the past, there is a true storyline to each of his games, but he leaves much of that open to interpretation by the player. Whereas we may never get an explicit statement as to why a certain enemy appears in a certain location, or why it is repeated, there's almost always a reason beyond simple laziness of reusing assets to pad gameplay time in a game that already has 100+ hours of unique and interesting content. This is, I think, the reason FromSoft would be most likely to cite for their reasoning, which they of course will never do, because that's not how they communicate with their fans. When players encounter a reused boss and think to themselves, why is this boss here? I think FromSoft wants the player to actually stop and think about that question. Why is that boss there? As an experiment, if you're replaying Elden Ring, which is most likely if you're seeking content at this level of discourse about the game, or maybe you're just playing for the first time and have seen this argument in reviews, at each boss encounter, ask yourself, why is this boss here? Some of these answers will be fairly obvious, such as unique bosses like Renala or Radahn, or even some catacomb bosses like the Grave Wardens. Some repeated enemies could simply conceivably be elites of their kind, such as the Tree Sentinels, the Night Cavalry, or the Black Knife Assassins, who could wear the same armor but be different people. Or perhaps there are powerful creatures with similar appearances, such as deathbirds or magma worms. Others you may need to think back on and reflect in light of later revelations. Let me take an example from one of the bosses that I actually agree, from a gameplay novelty perspective, was reused too many times. Well, to be fair, it's two bosses. The Godskins. For my own personal taste, I would have preferred if a third Godskin was designed and each used twice with no duos, but that is quite likely simply nitpicking. Bear in mind also that my lore may be misinterpreted to some extent, as stories are not always clear, and I am not Vadi, so I don't have spreadsheets of lore with flowcharts clearly referencing and keeping things straight. But I will try to piece together what I can from their story. The Godskin Apostles are a cult who drew their god-slaying powers of the Black Flame from destined death. Their leader, the Dusk-Eyed Queen, was defeated by Malekith, however, and Marika sealed the Rune of Death inside his blade. After a fragment of the rune was stolen by Rani the Witch, Malekith sealed the rest of it in his own body. The Godskins, as we encounter them, seem to be searching of reclaiming their power of death. Let's think about where we meet the Godskin Apostles, nobles included. I will be excluding their appearances as spirits because these are, well, spirits, and not there of their own volition. The first place I personally encountered a Godskin Apostle was in Dominula, the Windmill Village. The Windmill Village is said to harbor a dark secret, and upon further examination, I think it's a fair conclusion that this is where the Godskin robes are made. There are seemingly skinless corpses burning in piles, and the celebrants have various implements made of human bone, which seems to be of a type that would be used for dismembering or removing skin. The apostles themselves wield a weapon called a peeler, which I think is pretty straightforward. The second location of a Godskin, and the one I'm least certain of the placement reasoning, is in the basement of the Divine Tower of Caelid. After defeating this rogue apostle, you can find the Godslayer Greatsword in a chest nearby, perhaps indicating that he either sought it for himself, or was placing it there for safekeeping. The Godskin nobles have similar plausibility in their location. One can be found in the Volcano Manor, which may seem arbitrary, but I think has the implication that he either sought to claim the power of, or perhaps served, Rykard the Blasphemer, a demigod whose self-declared goal was to devour the very gods. The second Godskin noble appears on the bridge to the divine tower of Liurnia. This is where you find Rani's discarded flesh, which bears, fittingly, half of the curse mark of death, which has the power to release destined death from its confinement. The final location of the Godskin Apostles is in the Fara Mazula, where you fight the Godskin duo. This is where most players would roll their eyes at having to fight the Godskins yet again, but is, strangely, the most fitting place that you could find them, on your route to fight Malekith, who bears destined death within his own body. It seems quite clear that they are not here to guard him, as a Draconic Sentinel does further ahead, but rather they regard you as a rival who would lay claim to destined death on your own, and so, these final Godskins seek to put an end to your ambitions. I hope that this demonstrates the point that I am trying to make, even if my lore is a little squirrely, or if you still find that you do not enjoy the mechanics of a certain fight, or that its repetition alone irritates you. You may still think that the repetition is unnecessary, or simply not fun, but hopefully you will agree that the situation is not simply one of good and bad, but of trade-offs and careful thought. In the end, for those of us who enjoy Elden Ring, I don't find it useful to go around picking fights and quibbling about minor preference disagreements. What matters is that the game is fun for you, and when we find compromises we can all agree on, somewhere in the middle of our positions, we can find new appreciations, and perhaps what we all agree on will help to steer the games that we love. If you found this video constructive, leave a like and perhaps share your own opinions on Elden Ring's bosses in the comments. If you'd like to contribute towards further productions, consider leaving a tip at the link below. As always, thank you for watching, and long may the sun shine.